Okay, it is 12:05 on January 11th, 2024. And I'm gonna call this meeting of the Finance Committee to order. In the room, we have member Holloman and key staff members. And online, we have members Wilson and Jacobs. And so that's at least two members of member Wilson and I are members of the Finance Committee, and we will keep track of anybody else who joins. We have a few items on the agenda today. The first one is the fund balance. So I guess I will hand it off to Andy Ratliff.
All right, thank you. For the record, Andy Ratliff, Chief Financial Officer for the district. I'm going to share our fund balance projections for the rest of this year. So the first page is our revenue projections. We'll walk through these in some detail. Local property taxes, we expect to receive what we requested. Student fees are going to be down about 600,000 as we're looking at now. One is waiving parking fees for students as something we did this year. Our participation, or at least the paying folks for sports, are down a little bit. And then I think 150,000 or so of that loss is related to the lower Yukon program. So that one in the lower Yukon program, they pay for what they use for the third session at King Tech. So if their fees are lower, then so is our cost. So that's kind of, and that's all kind of aggregated below with some of the expenses. You don't really see a line item broken out for that, but just know that some of that decrement in revenue is also a decrement in costs later on.
I have actually a question on that. So does that mean that my understanding was that the agreement with the lower Yukon school district was that those students who are using the King Tech facility, like the third shift, so have they stopped that program entirely, or there's just fewer students?
No, it's just a little lower than what we anticipated.
Okay.
So we budget like about 500,000 for the cost of it, and about the same amount in revenue for the program. So if they only had 3 quarters worth or something, they might spend 300,000 or 350,000 versus the whole 500.
Got it.
But yeah, it's still a great program. And really kind of the basis on that is students, the ASD students benefit too, because we can take those classes if they don't fill up all the seats, or our students can take them.
Great.
So that program has been working great. Still excited about that. The big change between this projection and the one we presented in early December is within the interest earnings. That's about a little over 2.5 million above what we had anticipated. That's largely being driven by the federal prime rate being at 8.5% about now. That's double what it was about a year ago. So as that prime rate goes up, the amount we earn on the money that we have in the bank goes up. And then one of the other things in November and December, the mark-to-market approach for our invested accounts, we earn about 2.5 million on that. So that's where you see that increase is really in relation to that mark-to-market approach, which could change by the end of the year. But at this time, our interest earnings are looking a whole lot better than what we projected at this time, or this time last year. So we are going to look at those. I think in the pro forma, we had about a $5 million total projection for interest earnings. We may look at revising that, but again, that's going to come with risk with the mark-to-market approach. And if the Fed starts to see any sort of deflation because of these high interest rates, they might start trickling down that federal prime rate. So that's one we'll keep an eye on. E-rate's coming in about where we projected, and then other local revenues is about 32 million below budget, but that includes 32.45 million in fund balance. So we don't recognize that as an actual expenditure or actual revenue source. We just have it on the budget side. The big delta on there is we received a little over $400,000 for the Juul settlement that's included in that other local line now. So as we go through here, we anticipate pulling that money out and using it for vaping related mitigation efforts. Not exactly sure what those will look like. We're working with our mental health and other folks, or folks that kind of have more, I guess, knowledge of this than I do, to figure out what we can do to help mitigate the kind of vaping epidemic that we have in some of our schools. So just know that that money may be transferred out eventually. But that's kind of the reason why it's a little off projections from the last time we did.
And that's within the other local revenues, you said?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. For state funding, anticipate being down about 6.4 million. That's due to loss of enrollment and kind of the net loss of enrollment in both brick and mortar and correspondence schools, but an increase in intensive needs students. So that's, that's kind of what we're tracking. That'll be kind of rolled into the projections for next year. And we will have some savings on the correspondence side where we're able to recoup some money from a particular family partnership as they lost about 800 students below what they were projecting. So that'll you'll see that later on as we look into this big balance and unallocated account on the expense side. But this is about what we projected in November or into December. The other ones, impact aid, and I think Medicaid is probably the other ones that's got a more significant variance, just as we're not. That seems to be pretty inconsistent about when the billings are submitted to the state and when the money is received back. It's kind of a weird system that the state has set up where, if we bill $100,000 in Medicaid claims, we have to pay the state $50,000 first to get that $100,000 back or something. So they pay. It ends up just being able to take the federal portion of the Medicaid claims. They split that between federal and state sources. But it is a really kind of an odd program. We have to pay them half the amount to get the full amount back somehow, instead of just giving us the half.
So this is really a snapshot in time.
Well, this is projecting out
This
too.
is projected, okay.
Yeah, so we do, we haven't received this amount yet. We anticipate receiving it. It's pretty consistent with what we've received in the last few years. Looking at ways we can increase that revenue through our special education department and being able to bill for these Medicaid services. So overall, we're looking at about $30 million below our revenue budget, with the expectation it's going to be about 32 and a half at the budget when we develop the budget. So on the revenue side, we're looking good, mostly saved by that interest earnings line. Is there any questions on that revenue?
I'm gonna walk back, so I believe there are no stupid questions, so I'm just gonna ask it. So I just wanted to review, so here in the projection, right, we're 30 million below revenue, but we expect, can you just restate what you're?
We expect.
But because of the increase in interest earnings that's projected.
Well, so there's the three big moving parts on here. We would have expected if we had received all the revenue that we had budgeted for, we would expect that line to say a minus 32.45 million.
Okay.
That's because we don't recognize the amount we spend in fund balance as an actual revenue source. So you'll see that in the other local revenues line up here, 32.45 million of this is fund balance. However, we already have that money, so we don't actually receive it as an actual. So you would expect this line to be 32.45. However, we did lose money on the state side with our foundation funding, but we increased it on the local side with our interest earnings. So the net of all those is a minus 30 million instead of a minus 32.45, which was what we budgeted.
Got it.
So we're doing better than what we budgeted.
Got it.
The other thing to note on the difference on the budget and actuals is on the state side, we have this PERS and TERS on behalf payments. We don't actually put those in the budget book. So if you're looking for the budget book, you won't find those. They're just kind of an adjustment to the basis of budgeting. But we do, for this presentation, we do include them as it relates to the 10% calculation for the state and what our variance is. So if we don't have the budget line item, then that skews that variance by 38 million. And we do include that on the expense side too, and those always match. Just want to move on down to the expenditures. For salaries, we're expecting to be well under budget on everything except for substitutes. The biggest line items are the professional and technical. That's really one that typically in years past hasn't been that far under budget. That's most of our professional folks are, that's where we put our accountants, HR professionals, a lot of it is IT folks, behavior folks that are in special education, security officers, all those kind of professional technical folks that we have in our buildings. But typically those positions are more filled than what they are. We've had a lot more turnover and a lot more vacancies within there. Clericals, pretty consistent with what we've seen. So are paraprofessionals, which, that's the 100 and some plus vacant paraprofessional folks we have, particularly in special education, as those have had a lot of turnover and been really hard to fill. And then with teachers, about almost $10 million under budget. I believe that's reflective of about 130 or so vacant positions that are being covered by substitutes. Most of them are in special education. However, some of them are, you see those vacancies from the budget between secondary and elementary as well, as we filled those positions with long-term subs at this point, and there's not a lot of appetite to start disrupting those classrooms. The other ones, principals, operations and maintenance, are pretty well in line with what we'd expect. On the operations and maintenance side, we do build in some contingency as that maintenance contract is still unsettled for this year. So we do have some component built in there to be able to address that. And then the added duty extra help is pretty consistent with prior years, as is the other classification. A lot of what's in the other is leave and leave usage. So we have that, and then some other smaller one-off type categories. And then when we get to the attrition, that minus 8 million is what we budgeted for unfilled positions. So as you look at that, and we have a minus 8 million for unfilled positions, and then we're still going to have 5.6 million left over. So our total attrition that we're looking at in our salaries is about 13.8 million. So if you add those two together, that bottom line with the salaries and wages here, plus the attrition, that gets to your total attrition number. So right now we're expecting about $13.8 million in just salary attrition. As you look down into the benefits, you can do that same calculation here. So about 27.8 million in total salary or benefit attrition. Most of that's up here within this medical contributions. So as folks either turn over and have a 60-day wait, or the positions are vacant, or they just waive medical insurance, that's where the bulk of those savings are generated. So that's really kind of what we've been seeing. I don't know that that's just kind of steadily increased over the years, the number of people who are waiving insurance. So about overall, and then the rest of the benefits, the PERS and TERS and these other benefits have generally just tied to what's remaining in salary accounts as their percentages of whatever our salary payments are. And again, that's where you see the PERS and TERS on behalf. So total, we had about 13.8 million in salary attrition, and about 27.8 million in total benefit attrition. So for a total of about 41.6 million in overall, either medical cost waived or position vacancies, turnovers throughout the year. And that's what we're talking about in the pro forma, when we have about, I think we've included $36 million in our pro forma for next year for attrition. This is where we start talking about how much risk is the district willing to take on by upping that attrition number. And also keep in mind that 41.6 million, that also includes the $3.2 million that was approved Tuesday night for the AEA Health Trust, or the PhD Health Trust. So without that one-time payment, you're closer to 44 million in total attrition. General fund into this other fund. If it's for the PhD, it goes from the general fund into PhD. Thank you.
Yesterday, I think in the news, Governor Dunleavy repealed an 8% rule having to do with health insurance, this is not my area of expertise. Is there a sense in ASD that that is going to change our outlook in any way, shape, or form?
I believe that would be up to the individual plans of how much they pay. Like right now, my understanding of that is if you bill $100 for services, state statute requires that plan to pick up 80% of it, so $80. With the repeal of that, I think it would say that or at least for I think it's out of network things, but that the plan would be able to negotiate that rate separately, so they would not necessarily have to be 80%. So I think it would be plan specific as to whether or not they make changes with how much they're paying those providers. But I think that'd probably be a more detailed question for Marty and his team to.
That would only be people covered under a private insurance carrier, which we don't have very many. It wouldn't affect PhD, it wouldn't affect the district, it wouldn't affect,
I mean, it would be okay. Great.
well, like Blue Shield. I think most of the time that is just a paperwork process. So, like we use them, but they're not actually providing coverage, so they're not.
I guess the
Yeah, I think
broadest
that's probably
question is, does anything that happened yesterday have bearing on our financial outlook for next year?
I don't know.
Maybe we don't know
offhand.
that.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we'll probably have to do a little more research on,
Okay.
talk to Marty and Ty and see if we can get some
Okay.
clarification on what that might mean for us.
Okay.
But I mean, again, I mean, part of that too is the contractual language of how much we're paying into these funds is set by the bargaining groups and not by the claims experience.
Right.
The claims experience certainly informs how we negotiate those, but we would still be paying the same amount into those entities. Okay, so going down the list for services, utilities, we're continuing to see a little bit of savings on there with relation to mostly heat and electric. So
Can I ask why we're seeing savings in heat and electric? Is that because of other investments from previous projects or?
some of it's, I mean, it's both a component of what we budgeted for an increase in kilowatt hours or whatever they measure the natural gas in cubic feet or however it is. So just the commodity price and then the usage. So if usage is down with having a warmer winter than typically is normal,
Got it.
then that would cause it. And then just how much we budget is the other for the commodity. So we're looking at trying to make sure to get that adjusted. I think in the pro forma, we said we're one of those, forget whether it's heat or electric, that it's gonna either remain flat or like very minimal increase, because we did increase it this year that didn't realize. But that one's kind of hard to predict because we don't know the commodity prices, and we do have some RCA filings in hand, but we don't know where those will go to. Rents and leases, hoping to get that down a little bit. That one, we're still waiting on the board. That might come down a little bit as the board makes a decision for our next board meeting for the Ed Center lease. But the majority of that was, or the rest of that is going to be in charter schools. We have a couple other small leases with like Step Up and ACT program.
Okay.
But those are going to be fully expended. Travel registrations generally underspent by some amount and then this includes student travel and like activities travel. So any sort of movement of people or students is included in there. Typically don't spend all our money every year. The unallocated amount that's going to be left over, almost all this money that's in unallocated is reserved for charter schools. Some of it's within under the purview of the districts for some contingencies, but most of this is the money that they've rolled over from prior years. And the amount that's going to be remaining would be projected how much we think that of the money that the charter schools had to give back to us. It's going to sit out there in this unallocated account until it's transferred out or it rolls back into fund balance at the end of the year. And then other contracted services, that's a big line item in total dollars. But what that is, it's mostly, it covers like UAA tuition for AMCS. It'll cover charter schools, the correspondence schools when they go take classes. It covers IT maintenance agreements, so all the software we buy. And then like special education contracts when we can't hire like OT/PT folks and we move that from salaries into contracts, that increases that. And then legal fees goes into that kind of other. So that's a big thing. And then building and grounds maintenance costs when we get contracts for those. So it encompasses a lot of areas and it's a big line item. But we don't anticipate having some leftover funds there, as again, not everyone spends all their money. That's kind of the same with supplies down here. Equipment's expected to be a little bit over as our depreciation that for the funds that go into our equipment replacement fund. The depreciation on existing equipment is a little higher than what we had budgeted for. And then the general liability insurance claims, that's just exactly what it is, just how much we pay in general liability and insurance, because we're self-insured for that general liability up to a certain threshold. The other expenditures shows a negative 220,000. That is a product of us writing down some old debt from rentals, specifically things that were maybe a decade old from a UAA where we had an agreement with them in place not to charge for facility usage, sans a couple of specific facilities like the Alaska Airline Center. But we had these we had these, I guess, balances in our accounts receivable for rentals, actually for about 10 years now, and then came to light. I saw, let's just write that down. I'm not going to collect it. So that's why you see that negative item. It's just kind of an account cleanup thing. So at the end of this, we do have this budget to gap reconciliation for those of you who really love budget presentations and we'll do that. We take our gap basis reconciliation, we minus out what's encumbered from prior years. We subtract out what we have for on behalf that we don't budget, and then add back in transfers to other funds to get to the $610 million actual budget that was adopted. So we do like to provide that, how that crosswalk turns into what you guys actually approved in terms of total dollars. So overall, revenues minus expenditures and other transfers out will be down about 10 million. All things being equal, you would have seen this about 32 million, the same as the amount that we used for fund balance. So sitting pretty good at this point. Bottom line, kind of what's to be looking at is the amount that we've discussed on Tuesday is using down to 5% of fund balance. Our previous projection was 71 million. Now we're at about increase that by about 5.5 million, predominantly due to just having a little more information on both our salaries and our utilities and kind of getting those expenditure items, but as well as the increase in interest earnings and the jewel money. So while that did go up by about 5.5 million, there's a couple of unaccounted for costs in here. One being the jewel money, we expect that to be transferred out and used for, like I said, vaping mitigation efforts. And then we do have the costs for to accommodate sixth graders moving into middle schools. There are going to be supply costs, some furniture, and then some facility upgrades and maybe relocating building changes as well. We're expecting that to be a couple $1 million. We're trying to get that proposal nailed down this week and get a memo in front of the board so we can get moving out on that.
Okay, so we shouldn't go around saying we have $76.5 million in fund balance to allocate because.
Not quite yet, yes.
Okay.
So yeah, so I think we'll still stick for the 71 for now. We'll try to get more data, and if we can get more in the next month or so, by the time the budget's approved, that'll help inform how much money we really have on the fund balance. Kind of cautionary tale, you probably saw in the news yesterday with Juneau coming out. I suspect they were only one or two people deep doing this work, and just like we're only one or two people deep doing this work as well. So we really want to do our diligence and make sure that we're not in a situation where we're overspent. And so that's kind of really how much of this fund balance you really want to start using when we don't know the full picture for the remaining of the year. An emergency comes up and we've already allocated that money. It could get pretty painful and have to make some on the fly adjustments. So just that's just using that as a cautionary tale, and we'll watch this closely and see where it goes.
Okay, thank you. That was thorough mid-year update and really kindly. Any other questions online? Yep. Okay, I want to move. We have 3 other items on the agenda. I'd like to go to the bond debt update, which is item number 3, and make sure we get that taken care of. So let's go to item number 3 and then maybe circle back to the back version.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, oh yeah, Andy pulled it up, or someone pulled it up. So when you look at fiscal year 10, there's really one key date. And that is in January 2015. Ever since then, we have not had state bond debt reimbursement for any new bonds. When we sell a bond, it's amortized over 20 years. So you pay it back over an extended period of time. So we still do have a lot of bond debt that is partially state reimbursed. If you look at fiscal year 10, the average of all that total bond debt, which was, $770 million at that point, probably 60% of that was covered by the state. And then 30 to 40%, depending on what the type of project was, would have been covered by ASD. So when you start at fiscal year 10, you'll see that we were just under $800 million in total bond debt. Many years of school board saying that really bonds should be tied to how much we're paying off. So whenever we had new bonds, it needed to be less than what we were paying off, so we could always show that it would always have a downward trend. And there's a few bumps, but by and large that did happen. And if you look at the beginning of this fiscal year, because we still have a couple more bond debt payments, we started at about $436 million. So it went from almost 800 to 436. At the same time, in fiscal year 10, we started at about $170 million in total deferred maintenance for every facility in the district. Because we kept bonding for less than what we paid off, we certainly were not keeping in touch with maintaining the facilities, which if you look on average around the nation, I don't think most school districts actually do it, but you will see a lot of recommendations for facilities to be about 4% of the total utility costs or facility value. I don't know of a single district at any conference I've ever been to that's been able to do that. Generally, that's why at some point, it's certainly in the last 5-6 years, people have been getting rid of facilities that they no longer use to reduce the facilities that they have to maintain. And it does, in many cases, you spend a lot less on daily maintenance when you rebuild a whole new facility than in trying to every day maintain a very old facility. So you'll see that grew the total backlog from about 170 million to just over $1 billion in that 13-year period. And we did cross the line the second year I was the CFO. We knew it was coming and we knew that this was going to be the trend. But it definitely does show an interesting perspective of how the bond debt kept going down. Now, the one thing that it doesn't show, and I could make it show it in some way, is again, back in fiscal year 10, about 60 to 70%, depending on the projects, was state reimbursed. Now in FY23, because we're still paying off a lot of older bonds, it's 26.6%. So there's a much bigger percentage of the total bonded debt that is on ASD proper or the property owners in Anchorage. And that's just a result of every bond since January 15 has been 0% state reimbursement. And there's other reasons why the total bond debt went down. There's refunding, there's all these other things that within the life cycle of a bond, you can get a better interest rate and actually lower the total overall cost. But mostly it's what's the max that we can make a bond this year and still get it passed.
Well, I think it's a pretty compelling chart. I appreciate the update. I remember seeing this a year or 18 months ago. And I think it's important to keep in mind as we head towards the April election and our bond and the need to get our schools safe and in good working order. So, great. Okay, well, let's go back to item number 2, which is any questions from the FY23 ACFR, and this was originally something we had thought about putting on the December agenda, and that was altered to accommodate Dr. Pegas visiting in town.
I think on some history on this, we did have I believe at the November Finance Committee, we went through some of the schedules of the draft, and then we had the auditor speak to the full board at the work session. And then a couple days after that, we published it and sent it to the state. So we do have our book. I thought it turned out really nice. We did make the change where we stopped doing the state supplemental report and just included that and reformatted it so it's compliant with state reporting standards. So we only have the one book now. So again, big thanks to our finance team. They did a great job putting all this together. But just wanted to we never actually had that opportunity to open up for questions as people undoubtedly read it and have many questions now.
I think this may come as a surprise to some of the board members who were here or in online. I think one of the things that I value about this document, number one, is the sort of the narrative section up front. It really gives a comprehensive overview of the district's financial situation. And then at the very end, the statistical section allows you to look at changes in the district over time. So I find it, I've dog-eared it, and I think it's really interesting. One of the things that I am interested in understanding is, total salaries and benefits are about 86% of our expenditures. How much of those salaries and benefits are sort of the classroom teachers and the questions, what's instruction and what's not instruction, but of our salaries and benefits, we have a world of classroom instructors and then the support staff that makes the schools function. And they're all valued, but that's certainly something that I feel like people want to understand. And so do we have a general sense of the relationship between?
If you look at the back, towards the back, there's an appendix that shows by state function over time. I can't remember which, it's under the, but there's one that shows over time, and it'll show how much was instruction, how much was.
Okay.
You can see that, but to get the real picture.
And that's not necessary, that's just total instruction.
Right.
So that would include instructional software, supplies, and everything that goes into it. Let's see, so page 105. Pull it up for.
Oh, great. President Bellamy is online. Thank you so much.
So page 105, that's where we start getting into. Pull it up a little bit. So here's we start kind of separating that out between the classifications within those divisions. So instruction, 120 million in certificated salaries. That's going to be our teaching staff for the most part. That would also include some addenda related duties for instruction, not just their total salaries. And then we have the non-certificated salaries, which is by and large gonna be our teaching assistants and then other attendant extra help that would go in there, substitutes and things like are in there as well. The benefits are the sum of those two categories, the benefits associated with them, those lumped together. So, and then you see the same thing in the special education instruction, which are also classroom teachers. So you can kind of tease that out. It would be a little more of a math problem, but the information is in there to be able to pull it
I
out.
think to get the cleanest picture, you'd want to add the ESSER teacher salary, teachers,
Sure, yeah.
because they really did. It was easier to throw a bunch of teachers than it was to spread it across every single skill specialty.
Particularly for this year, we had,
Right,
for 2023, we had a whole lot of teachers in that ESSER money. But this is just general fund that's presented here. We do have similar schedules for all our grants, so you could find that as well in the eServe money, I believe. I don't know offhand what page that would be on.
Okay, well, I can have some more fun with page 105, down the road. One of the other pages that I folded over to ask about, and this is predating Dr. Bryant's time as superintendent, but everyone says cut administration as part of our budget solution. There's table TT, which is page 259, shows historical sort of employee categories over time. And there was a big jump in FY20. And my memories, before I was on the board, I think there was a reorganization, but is there any way we could understand the increase in sort of administration at that moment in time?
Yes.
Which has then since, sort of wobbled, but that was a jump that.
And I do have that written up somewhere. I can't remember offhand what the reasoning was. But I think it was just the way that things were classified, particularly within like food service and transportation and how those were. But I do have a write-up because someone did inquire about that last year.
oh, that's the
I
year
did.
we split out the attrition accounts to each bargaining group.
No, this is just
that the year
an
I-
employee count
Okay,
from our budget. So it's but there was a classification thing. It wasn't like new employees, it was just how we were reporting it.
That was kind of what I remember reading about at some point. I just thought it was worth discussing. There was not suddenly influx of dozens of new administrators. It was just people were.
oh, I've got that in that
labels
one
around them.
spreadsheet by state function, that's right, because you took the whole, like. Student nutrition and other
Yeah.
departments where we didn't have them as administrative, but they really were administrative in nature, so they were shifted from one category over to another.
So it was not.
It is written down somewhere, I can forward that spreadsheet, Andy.
Well, I've got it all. I've got an
Oh,
email
you've got
written
it,
up
okay.
somewhere, that this is. I think a community member had inquired about this last year. And so we went back and did all the research on it, and did a big write-up on it for the member, and I had that somewhere I
Okay.
can forward it on.
It was something that I thought, and it was just always good to be refreshed and be able to answer community members' questions about, why is this certain part of the organization the way it is.
Yeah, because after they brought it up, I was like, oh, that seems odd. I don't remember adding them. So we did look at it. There was like a classification issue more than it wasn't versus like really adds to administration.
Were there any other board members with pressing questions about the FY23 ACFR? Yes,
Member
yes.
Jacobs.
Okay, member Jacobs.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. A question for administration. I think this past budget cycle, if not the budget cycle before, there was kind of a helpful breakdown that compared district administrative costs across at least the big five. I'm curious if there's been capacity to delve into that project at all. I'm understanding it. There probably isn't an apples to apples pure comparison to do, but something similar.
I don't know that we've got that done. We can certainly look at trying to pull that together. And really for the general fund, that should be fairly apples to apples because we have all the same requirements to report the same types of positions in each state function. So in district administration, they're all gonna have a superintendent, they're all gonna have a school board, they're all gonna have their chief executives in there. So we can get that. The other way that we look at that too is the indirect cost rates that are published, which is a reflection of those categories as divided into their total operating budgets. So we do have that. That information is out there. And the big five, they do publish all their financial statements. So we should be able to tease out the total amount that's district administration and district administration support as a percentage of total budgets. But I would say, so a lot of those districts, the smaller they get, the higher that percentage is just going to be. As you have, we have one superintendent cost spread across 43,000 students, where some of them might have one superintendent cost spread across 2,000 students. So you would expect the smaller the district to get, the higher those percentage of administration to be.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for the question. I want to preserve a little bit of time for FY25 budget conversation. So I sincerely appreciate the work that has gone into producing, reviewing, making the ACFR available. I think it's a great historical resource and piece of public information. So the fourth item on our agenda is the FY25 budget discussion. And I would like to see if any board members have any follow-up conversations or follow-up questions that they'd like to ask. We did spend some time talking the other night. I know that I had one question. And so we were talking about the immersion program item, and actually, Dr. Bryant, you reflected on the proposed efficiency here that's 1.4 or $1.5 million could help sustain the program in the long run. And I guess I really don't understand what reducing immersion program supplemental PTR means. So if you could help me understand that,
Sure.
that's appreciated.
Yeah, correct. And feel free to chime in
Yeah.
with it, but at a high level, what we're doing is essentially holding those immersion classrooms harmless. Not in every situation. In some of our immersion classrooms that I've been in, they have combination classrooms. But for a number of programmatic reasons, if you want to implement an immersion classroom with fidelity, ideally, right, you'd have a teacher for every grade level. But when we assign PTR, or when we assign staff by school, you don't receive extra teachers just because you have an immersion program or a highly gifted program. So what happens is when you're trying to maintain your immersion programming, but the PTR goes up, then you need to collapse positions. And oftentimes what happens is that on a neighborhood side of the school, those are the ones that have a lot more combination classrooms than on the immersion side, because the idea is, well, I have fewer teachers, I need to make a decision as to which classrooms I'll collapse. That said, we're getting to a point to where I'm seeing combination immersion classrooms, but with regards to the budget, essentially what we've been doing for years is using holdback positions or holdback equivalents to really keep those programs whole. And at this point, just given the frequent increases in PTR, we need to approach it more equitably and to not essentially further subsidize the cost of immersion programs, and to really determine a way to do it in a way that's fair and consistent.
So
I'd also say it's due to the class sizes in those immersion programs. So if they have, and like most of the time they haven't had combination classrooms, so if they have 15 or 20 kids in a immersion class, the corresponding neighborhood class is going to have 35 or 40 if you keep with that same PTR staffing. So it's really just those class sizes also on the immersion side that have been lower. So to be able to maintain normal class size in the regular ed side of those schools, we have to put more FTE into the buildings.
So the documentation that sort of accompanied this in I think it was the December 9th work session, sort of write-up, said that the savings that we get from this particular item eliminates 12 FTE above staffing. So as the net result, then we would be seeing like an immersion combo 3-4 class.
You may need to see some combinations.
Whereas that's not something that we've really seen before.
Right now, historically, we've assigned holdbacks or the equivalent of a holdback to maintain that. And
Okay.
at this point, we need to have that burden shared across an entire site. And frankly, moving, looking 5-6 years down, we may need to think about what consolidation or reimagining those programs are. But I hope that our funding situation is less dire by it.
Is there, oh, sorry.
Just go ahead.
Okay. Is there any financial savings from an FTE standpoint of bringing 2 or more immersion programs into a single hub facility? I mean, is that a more efficient use of staff? I mean, if you're speaking, language 1 and language 2, I guess you still need English, teachers who are teaching in English. So maybe there are no, I don't know, I wonder if we've talked about, bringing together Birchwood and, multiple school combinings, but are there any efficiencies that can be gleaned by combining language immersion programs?
I could envision some models.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just trying to let you know that Member Jacobs has had his hand up.
Great, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
This is something that I've spoken with Mr. Gustafson about at length. There are multiple models, but I will say, particularly with high school, there is a universe where we could have a world language hub to where we can consolidate advanced foreign language courses in one building. That's not something that we intend to formally propose to the board at some point. I do think if there were a way to consolidate specialized programs into fewer buildings, it would provide relief, especially since, this time next year, I hope to propose to the board a set of recommendations on school consolidations. And if the big goal is to have higher capacity elementary schools, we can determine a way to also house specialized programs in fewer sites so that it's less of a burden on our schools. That's one option, is to do that. The other option is to completely reimagine the way that we allocate our staffing. Right now, we treat a school that houses a program like immersion the same as a school that doesn't. So we could theoretically completely re-envision the staffing model to where if you have an immersion program, maybe you do get more resources, but we're not in that place financially to do that. But there are multiple ways. And this gets very technical when you're talking about immersion. There are some benefits, but we're talking about distinct languages. So some of the same limitations to staffing an immersion program exists, regardless of whether it's in multiple buildings or in one building. But it is something we put a lot of thought in.
Okay, so I want to make sure we get to the other board members' comments, but in essence, when reduced immersion programs, supplemental PTRs on the table, that doesn't mean that we're cutting immersion programs. It does mean that how they're going to be staffed may look a little bit different. There are going to be fewer resources bolstering them.
Right, the proposal is not to eliminate immersion, but it's to be realistic and to fairly distribute the burden to schools.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think I saw Member Wilson's hand up and then Member Jacobs online.
So immersion question, currently as it's structured now, because in the past, and I'll just throw it out there, in the past, my daughter was in a 1-2 immersion combo class. I remember at the time, Government Hill had a 5-6 combo class because of the number of students, because traditionally as immersion classes, unless something has changed, as you go along the higher grades, the lower number of students, because they move, they drop out, they whatever. So is that still the case, or are you still, is the intent still to combine those classes to continue providing the immersion, but to accommodate for the lack of students per grade level as it goes down? Are there, or has that changed over the years?
I mean, ideally, we wouldn't have those major drops, but it is something that we do see, right? And to your point, when a student leaves an immersion program in 4th or 5th grade, you wouldn't still,
Can't replace it.
right? Because by then they've obtained so many language skills that a student who's not fluent wouldn't be successful, most likely. So we would still see that, but I've seen some really good best practices. Rook School is our only whole school immersion program, and they're very intentional about the ways that they staff their kindergarten, first grade classrooms. But with that said, we also have to really look at demand for specific immersion programs. I'm frankly very concerned with a couple of our immersion programs because their kindergarten classes are very, very small. And if those kindergarten students in later years drop from the program, frankly, the entire program should be looked at. Because that adds to the cost per student tremendously, even if we do a combination. Because even those combination classrooms that I've seen are very small.
Yeah, nice.
I do want to throw out there that I am concerned about the schools that have half immersion, half neighborhood, that are getting the same amount of FTE. And the neighborhood schools are those classes are the ones that are burdened. And that's rough to see. It is rough to see. And it's rough to see in Rogers Park too, with the gifted program, and then the neighborhood school is the one taking the higher classrooms and the brunt of that difficulties. And I know Member Jacobs had.
Member Jacobs, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm different topic and backing up kind of the 30,000-foot level. I wanted to thank administration for the process that led us to passing guidance and the related memorandum. I was thinking back to my first year on the board, and what we were asked to do essentially was we got a draft of a budget. We were asked to prepare amendments and give kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down if administration should try again. And then, some last second amendments occurred. And I think the process that we utilized this year and last year is just much further refined and leads to a better product and less last second frenetics. And so appreciate the work that went into the memorandum, and then am anxiously looking forward to the kind of the finished product as we close out the budget cycle. My question, I guess, really for administration is, did the board fail to provide clarity on anything that administration needs more information on prior to presenting kind of a finished product to the board, or did the memo kind of take care of what it was intended to?
Yeah, I think we've got the information we need to. I mean, it's really just after that general guidance of, we don't want to put things up for reduction if we know the majority of the board's not going to support it, and just kind of lead to a drawn out, I guess, discussion about that and a lot of public testimony that's really unnecessary. So yeah, I think we're in a good spot where we can take the guidance, create a balanced budget along with that, and obviously it's not going to be what any of us wants, but it's, it'll be, I think, probably reflective of what, was the most palatable to reduce at this point.
Madam Chair, could I follow up?
Please do.
Yeah, thank you. And then thank you for the answer. We've informally talked about, and then Member Lessons proposed an amendment that kind of put pen to paper about creating kind of a quasi list of priorities to inject funding into should any significant level of funding be restored through either override or hopefully, and even better, a statutory increase to the base student allocation, especially in the latter, as one-time funding, as Dr. Bryan alluded to during the last board meeting, presents further instability where we might not be able to restore any significant cuts that are made year after year. Is administration considering an option where we communicate clearly to the legislature, this is our vision for what we would like to do with increased funding, or how do we ensure we articulate that? I feel like transmitting a budget, as much as it's a statement of values, I feel like we're what school districts are asked to do is kind of an incomplete or being asked to submit a statement of values without an additional paragraph, right? Because we can't adequately communicate the full scope of our message that we'd like to. And so, how does administration picture assisting the board, I guess, and communicating with elected officials in Juneau and the governor's office where we would like to see education go with increased funding?
I can chime in with my 2 cents. Personally, I plan to make the case where we need to focus our attention on the base student allocation because unpredictable, unreliable, and insufficient funding is a detriment, and we need to break the cycle of continuing to pay for teachers and educators from fund balances or one-time funds. Because if we're to receive one-time funds again this year, it's going to be very difficult for me to recommend continuing the cycle of having these structural deficits. I think that number has to go down at some point, but it's going up. So for me, I want to focus on, it's not so much what we'll do if we get more funding, it's the power of creating stability and structure if there's recurring funding through a base student allocation, because there's a lot of misinformation around the merits of a one-time investment in teacher retention, which I think misses the mark on the bigger conversations around the base student allocation. That's my 2 cents, but Andy has more articulate things to offer.
Right, I mean, I think if it's the will of the board, we could certainly, I think more than anything, it's what's gonna be at risk if we don't get funding. We have the Academies of Anchorage going forward, even implementing the READS Act, which is statute. Being able to put money into there, and then really whatever, you could make a pie in the sky thing where here's how much it would cost to implement the Picus-Auden metrics. If you want 15-1 at K4 and 25-1 after that, here's how much it's going to cost. So I think, even tying that back to what the commissioner said, of here's what the values are, and being able to recruit and retain teachers, being able to pay them more, having those lower class sizes, having the professional development, having those after school tutoring and summer school programs. I mean, that's kind of what we could articulate, but the requests that are in there is just getting us almost back to status quo. It's not providing money for these extra services. So that's really kind of where we're at, is one, we need to get back to a inflation adjusted metric and then inflation protected after that for planning purposes. But then if they really do want to make systemic change, we need to articulate where those dollars would go.
Is there a world where, and I feel like and we ask you guys to do a lot in limited times and limited resources. In February, we're gonna receive the budget, and there's often like that sort of the 15-16 page budget overview. Is there a way, and then we hand them out to legislators and anybody else who we think wants to read it. Could we have a section of that kind of dedicated to envisioning another world, or what we would do to Member Jacob's question, what we would do with an increase to the BSA, what we would do with sort of Picus-Auden level funding. And I don't know whether that just would extend, like this is what our PTR chart would look like instead. And instead of, a plus whatever for this year, we'd be like looking at a minus, whatever. It might it would help me to be able to sort of provide those
Yes.
different.
Certainly having some
outlooks.
documentation on that would be helpful, although, I think you risk some confusion if you try to put
Right.
it in that document of, here's what we'd like next to, here's what we have. Unless you read it really closely and understand, follow the conversations, I think that would get pretty confusing pretty quickly. But there might be like a separate document we can put together of here's kind of what we would like to see and what we would do with that money if it was received.
I think that would be. I'm only one member of the board, but I would find that valuable and helpful. And I know that we are at. Member Jacobs, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief. I know we're at time. Mr. Ratliff and Dr. Bryant, that's kind of what I've articulated, what Member Lessons has articulated is something I would support. What we are hearing, at least very early on, before everyone's taken a plane ride down to the southeast, is that there's an understanding among lawmakers as to that the BSA should be addressed. But I don't know that the vision, at least here in Anchorage, is something that's clearly understood. Not to say that it shouldn't be, that there isn't information already available, right? If someone put the time and dedication into it. But I think that's where we can help bridge the gap with adequate communication. And so however we choose to do it, I support, but I think that that's an opportunity for us to make sure we're doing everything we can and we lay it all in the field, I guess, this session. So I would support that too. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Jacobs. Anybody else on that note? Okay, the only thing I just wanted to share, because I sent an email to Mr. Ratliff last night about this question is, I know that I raised the question of paying for sports and activities. It came to my attention that if Juneau, the borough, may be paying for their sports and activities, not the school district itself. If we can, I mean, I appreciate that we don't have to pay for SROs with our budget. I don't know what the logistics would look like. I love to retain our sports and activities, but
I wonder if they've outsourced.
if they've outsourced, if there's another model, I'd rather we use $5 million of funds to go towards teaching. And retain our sports and activities, but I'm curious, and maybe that's a topic for a future finance committee.
And we can certainly look at that and, I mean, I think that's something I want to connect with you
There
on
are
the
some conversations to have.
because that is one of the things that comes up in that disparity test conversation when you're talking about the local maximum contribution is if this would be considered operating money that would go against that in-kind contribution, which I think Juneau was the district that really started that conversation about, we need to get more tight on what those administrative regulations at the state level are. So, I'd be cautious against just going out and doing that without doing quite a bit of research and getting the thumbs up from Deed to say that's acceptable. And then the other part of that is, does the city have headroom in their upper or their tax cap to be able to accommodate an additional 5 million? I suspect we'll be asking for additional tax relief for our transportation funding, which is, we've been told that is outside of the disparity test, at least for the short term. So above that, I don't know how much headroom we really have.
Yeah.
I'm hoping this will be quick, that if we have a student that moves from a charter to a neighborhood, or, sorry, from a neighborhood school to a charter school, how does that impact our budget for neighborhood schools?
I believe that happens quite often. They move back and forth between the two. It's depending on when they move, it is what the effect would have. If they do it before October, whatever receiving school gets all the money or either the district or charter would get the funding for it. If it happens during October, it's going to be split out somehow. It should be split out somehow. But if it happens after October count, then it just goes to whoever the initiating school was.
Do we
So
have leverage to have charter schools increase their PTR?
I don't believe we can either. I mean, they get their funding is based on statute, and then they balance it based on the funding that they're statutorily obligated to receive. So whatever their PTRs end up being, it's a school by school decision with their APCs.
Okay, we are over time. I appreciate the conversation and accept the motion to.
So move to adjourn.
Lisa, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Post copies of.
Said it, but that's what I wanted to say is that, really.